The moment I let that homeless old woman into my house, my neighbors looked at me like I had lost my mind. That was the sentence running through my head as I stood in the freezing parking lot outside Miller's grocery store on a cold November evening in Maplewood Heights, Illinois. The wind cut through my wool coat hard enough to make my hands ache, and people hurried past with shopping bags tucked close to their chests, pretending not to notice the elderly woman sitting alone near the shopping cart return. She looked exhausted, wrapped in a faded gray coat that was at least 20 years old, her silver hair tangled by the wind, an old leather suitcase resting beside her feet. Most people avoided eye contact completely. A teenage boy pushing carts laughed quietly with his friend as they walked by her, and a woman loading groceries into a Lexus SUV muttered, "This neighborhood is getting worse every year." I wish I could say I ignored it and kept walking like everyone else, but something about the way the old woman sat there stopped me. She wasn't begging. She wasn't shouting. She just looked tired, like someone who had spent too many years carrying pain alone. I tightened my scarf and walked toward her before I could talk myself out of it. "Ma'am," I said gently, "are you all right?" She lifted her head slowly. Her pale blue eyes looked surprisingly sharp despite the exhaustion on her face. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to bother anyone. I just needed somewhere warm for a little while." Her voice didn't sound rough or unstable like people expected from someone living on the street. It sounded calm, educated, careful. I glanced around the parking lot. Nobody was stopping. Nobody cared. "Do you have family nearby?" I asked. A strange sadness crossed her face before she answered. "Not anymore." The wind picked up again, and I noticed her hands trembling from the cold. That should have been the moment I walked away. At 67 years old, living alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood, every safety warning in America tells women like me not to trust strangers. But loneliness recognizes loneliness faster than anything else in this world. "I'm Helen," I said quietly. "You can stay at my place tonight if you'd like." For a second, she looked genuinely shocked. Then she lowered her eyes as if she wasn't used to kindness anymore. "My name is Vivian," she replied. "Thank you." The drive home felt uncomfortable at first. Vivian sat silently in the passenger seat of my old Buick while snow flurries drifted across the windshield. I could feel people staring at us at stoplights. Maplewood Heights was the kind of suburb where everyone noticed everything. Perfect lawns, matching holiday wreaths, expensive SUVs in every driveway. People here donated canned food during church drives, but crossed the street when they saw someone homeless in person. As we pulled into my driveway, I noticed my neighbor Diane Cooper standing outside with her little white dog. Her eyes widened immediately when she saw Vivian step out of my car, carrying that worn suitcase. Diane walked closer before I even reached the front porch. "Helen," she whispered sharply, "who is that?" "Her name is Vivian," I answered calmly. "She's staying here tonight." Diane looked horrified. "You brought a homeless stranger into this neighborhood?" I felt my cheeks burn. She needed help. Diane lowered her voice further. "People like that are dangerous." Vivian stood quietly beside me, pretending not to hear. That somehow made the whole thing feel worse. "Good night, Diane," I said firmly before opening the front door. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon candles and chicken soup I had made earlier that afternoon. Vivian stepped carefully onto the hardwood floor like she was afraid of touching anything. "You have a beautiful home," she said softly. "It's nothing fancy," I replied. But then something strange happened. Vivian glanced toward the dining room and said, almost absent-mindedly, "That chandelier looks like an original Waterford crystal piece from the late 80s. I blinked in surprise because she was right. My late husband had bought it in 1989. Most people would never know that just by looking at it. Before I could ask how she recognized it, headlights swept across my living room window. A black Mercedes slowly rolled past my house, almost as if the driver was looking for someone. Vivian froze for half a second before turning away from the window, and that was the moment I realized this woman might not be who she seemed at all. I barely slept that night. Something about Vivian unsettled me, but not in the way Diane had warned me about. It was the strange contrast between her appearance and the way she carried herself. Homeless people do not usually notice imported crystal chandeliers or sit with perfect posture at a kitchen table while drinking tea from a chipped floral mug like they are attending a formal dinner party. After I showed Vivian the guest room, I stayed awake downstairs pretending to watch late-night television while the wind rattled the windows outside. Around 11:30, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Vivian appeared near the staircase wearing the same faded gray coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "I hope I am not disturbing you," she said quietly. "Not at all," I replied. "Could not sleep." A faint smile crossed her face. "When you spend enough nights wondering where you will end up, your body forgets how to rest." There was something heartbreaking about the way she said it. I motioned toward the kitchen. "I made chicken soup earlier. There is still some left." "That sounds lovely," she answered. While I heated the soup, Vivian stood near the counter watching snow drift outside the dark kitchen window. For a moment, she looked less like a homeless woman and more like someone who had once belonged in those glossy magazine homes people admire but can never afford. "You have children?" she asked suddenly. I nodded. "One son, Andrew. He lives about 20 minutes away." "And does he visit often?" I hesitated before answering. "Not as much these days." Vivian gave a slow, understanding nod, like she already knew the rest without hearing it. Before I could ask another question, headlights flashed through the front window again. This time it was not the black Mercedes from earlier. It was Andrew's silver Range Rover pulling into my driveway. My stomach tightened immediately. "That would be my son," I said quietly. Vivian lowered her eyes. "Perhaps I should go back to the guest room." "No," I answered. "You are my guest." The front door opened before I even reached it. Andrew stepped inside first, still wearing his office coat, with Melissa following behind him carrying an expensive designer handbag tucked under her arm. Neither of them looked happy. "Mom," Andrew said sharply. "Diane called us." Of course she did. Melissa glanced past me and spotted Vivian standing quietly near the kitchen. Her expression changed instantly. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You actually brought her into the house." Vivian remained silent. Melissa stepped closer to me and lowered her voice, although not enough to stop Vivian from hearing every word. "Helen, this is insane. You do not know this woman. She needed somewhere warm for the night," I replied calmly. Melissa crossed her arms. "There are shelters for that." Vivian spoke softly without looking up. "The shelters were full." Melissa let out a frustrated laugh. "That is not our responsibility." I saw Vivian's fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the kitchen chair. Andrew rubbed his forehead like he was already embarrassed by the situation. "Mom, you cannot just bring random people into the neighborhood." Diane said everyone saw her arrive. I stared at my son in disbelief. "You drove over here at almost midnight because the neighbors saw me helping someone?" "Because we are worried about you." Melissa interrupted quickly, though her tone sounded more irritated than concerned. Then her eyes landed on Vivian's old suitcase near the staircase. "You really plan on letting her sleep here?" The room felt uncomfortably quiet. Vivian slowly stood up. "I do not wish to cause problems," she said gently. "I can leave." "No," I answered immediately. Melissa sighed dramatically and shook her head. "Helen, this is exactly how elderly people get taken advantage of." Something inside me hardened at the way she said elderly people, as if I were no longer capable of making my own decisions inside my own home. Vivian quietly reached into the pocket of her coat, pulling out a folded handkerchief. As she did, something slipped briefly into the light before disappearing again. A diamond ring, not costume jewelry. Real diamond, large enough that even Melissa noticed it. Her eyes narrowed for half a second before Vivian tucked her hand back into her pocket. "Where did you get that?" Melissa asked immediately. Vivian looked at her calmly. "It belonged to my husband." Melissa opened her mouth again, but Andrew interrupted. "Mom, just be careful, all right?" I looked directly at my son. "I am careful. That is why I know when someone deserves kindness." Neither of them answered. After a few more tense minutes, Andrew and Melissa finally left, though Melissa kept glancing back toward Vivian with visible suspicion. The moment the front door closed, silence filled the house again. Vivian stared down at the untouched bowl of soup on the counter. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Families become uncomfortable when money or fear enters a room." I frowned slightly. "Money." Vivian looked up at me then, and for the first time all night, I noticed something cold behind her tired blue eyes. Fear and money destroy people faster than almost anything else. Then she picked up the spoon and quietly continued eating her soup while snow fell heavily outside my kitchen window. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual because I could smell coffee drifting through the house. For a second, I forgot Vivian was there. Then I heard soft movement downstairs and pulled my robe tighter before walking toward the kitchen. I stopped halfway down the staircase when I saw her standing near the stove. The old gray coat was gone, folded neatly over a chair, and without it she somehow looked completely different. Not younger exactly, but dignified in a way that was difficult to explain. She stood straight with one hand resting lightly on the counter while pouring coffee into two mugs like she had spent years inside elegant kitchens. Morning sunlight spilled through the windows, catching the silver streaks in her hair. "I hope you do not mind," she said as she noticed me standing there. "I found the coffee beans." I smiled faintly. Most guests do not make breakfast their first morning. Vivian glanced toward the skillet where she had scrambled eggs and toasted sourdough bread. Most guests are not trying to. Thank someone for saving them from 30-degree weather. I laughed softly despite myself. The sound surprised me because I had not laughed much lately. We sat together at the small kitchen table while snow covered the backyard outside. Vivian held the coffee mug carefully between both hands, warming her fingers. "This is wonderful coffee," she said after taking a sip. "Colombian roast?" I blinked. "Yes. How did you know?" "The flavor is smooth without bitterness," she replied casually. "Most people buy darker roasts because they think expensive means strong." Again, it was the way she spoke. Calm, polished, precise. Not once did she sound embarrassed or defensive about her situation. If anything, she sounded like someone who had spent her entire life around educated people. I noticed her eyes drift briefly toward the family photos hanging beside the dining room. Pictures of Andrew as a little boy, my late husband standing proudly beside his fishing boat. Christmas mornings from years ago when the house still felt full of warmth instead of tension. "Your husband passed away?" Vivian asked gently. I nodded. 7 years ago. Heart failure. "I am sorry." There was no empty politeness in her voice. She meant it. After Richard died, I admitted quietly, everything changed. Holidays became smaller. Phone calls became shorter. Andrew got busy with work. "Melissa," I stopped myself. Vivian gave a faint knowing smile. "Melissa enjoys control." I looked up in surprise. "You noticed that already?" Vivian stirred her coffee slowly. People reveal themselves quickly when they believe someone beneath them is listening. The words settled heavily in the room. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past the house while snowflakes drifted across the street. Maplewood Heights looked beautiful in winter, but beneath all those polished front lawns and decorated porches, people spent most of their lives competing with each other. Bigger kitchens, better cars, more expensive vacations. Sometimes I wondered whether anyone in this neighborhood still remembered how to simply care about another person. "You know," I said carefully, "you still have not told me how you ended up out there." Vivian went quiet. For several seconds, she simply stared into her coffee. Then she gave a soft sigh. "Have you ever noticed how quickly people disappear once money becomes involved?" I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Families change," she answered. "Children become strangers. Love becomes paperwork." There was pain buried underneath her calm voice now. Real pain. Before I could ask anything else, her eyes suddenly shifted toward the front window. Her expression changed instantly. Sharp. Alert. "What is it?" I asked. Vivian stood slowly from the table and walked closer to the curtains. A black SUV had stopped briefly across the street, near Diane Cooper's mailbox. Tinted windows. Expensive vehicle. After a few seconds, it drove away. "Do you know them?" I asked. Vivian did not answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the diamond ring on her finger as if she had forgotten to remove it. Then she quietly slipped it off and placed it into the pocket of her coat, hanging nearby. "Old habits," she murmured. My stomach tightened again. Nothing about this woman added up. Not the way she spoke. Not the way she carried herself. Not the expensive jewelry she kept trying to hide. And definitely not the luxury vehicles appearing outside my house. Before I could question her further, the doorbell suddenly rang. I walked toward the front hallway, expecting maybe a package delivery or Diane coming over to gossip again. But when I opened the front door, Melissa stood there wearing oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy weather, her expression tight and uncomfortable. "Can I come in?" she asked. Then her eyes shifted past me toward Vivian sitting quietly in the kitchen. And for the first time since I had known my daughter-in-law, I saw something unexpected on her face. Not anger. Not disgust. Fear. Melissa stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, brushing snowflakes off her expensive wool coat while keeping her eyes fixed on Vivian. The tension in the room thickened immediately. Vivian remained seated at the kitchen table with both hands calmly wrapped around her coffee mug, but I noticed the subtle way her shoulders straightened the moment Melissa entered. "What is going on?" I asked carefully. Melissa removed her sunglasses slowly, and for the first time I saw genuine uneasiness behind her polished appearance. "Andrew is on his way," she said quietly. "Why?" "Because something strange happened this morning." Vivian lowered her eyes toward the table, though her expression barely changed. Melissa hesitated before speaking again. "There have been cars driving through the neighborhood since 6 o'clock. My stomach tightened slightly. "What kind of cars?" "Luxury cars," Melissa answered. "Black SUVs. Mercedes sedans. A Lincoln limousine." She looked directly at Vivian then. "People are saying they keep circling this street." Outside, another vehicle rolled slowly past the front window. I turned instinctively toward the glass. A black Cadillac Escalade moved carefully down the snowy road before disappearing around the corner. Vivian remained silent. Melissa crossed her arms tightly. I knew something about this situation was not normal. "Melissa," I said sharply, "stop acting like she is a criminal." "Then who is she?" Melissa snapped back. "Because homeless women do not usually have luxury cars searching for them." The room went quiet. Vivian finally lifted her gaze toward Melissa with surprising calmness. "You seem very interested in expensive things," she said softly. Melissa blinked, caught off guard by the comment. "Excuse me." "Cars," Vivian continued gently. "Jewelry. Neighborhood reputation. You notice status very quickly." Melissa's face flushed slightly. Before she could answer, the front door suddenly opened and Andrew stepped inside carrying his phone in one hand. He looked tense. "Mom," he said immediately, "have you looked outside?" I walked toward the living room window, and my breath caught in my throat. 3 black vehicles were now parked along the curb across from my house. Men in dark coats stood outside, one of them speaking quietly into earpieces. Diane Cooper stood halfway down her driveway, pretending to check her mailbox while staring openly at my home. Curtains moved all across the neighborhood as people watched from inside their houses. "This is unbelievable," Melissa whispered behind me. Andrew turned toward Vivian carefully now, no longer speaking to her like she was some helpless stranger. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "are these people here for you?" Vivian took a small sip of coffee before answering. "Most likely." The calmness in her voice unsettled everyone in the room. "Who are you?" Melissa asked again, this time almost demanding an answer. Vivian looked toward the snowy backyard instead of replying immediately. "Have you ever spent your life building something only to discover the people closest to you were waiting for you to become weak?" Nobody spoke. Even Melissa fell silent. Vivian's voice remained soft, but there was weight behind every word now. People behave very differently around money, especially family. Andrew exchanged an uneasy glance with Melissa. Then suddenly there was another knock at the front door. Not loud, controlled, professional. I opened it slowly, and my heart nearly stopped. 2 men stood on my porch wearing dark tailored coats despite the freezing weather. Behind them, a long black Mercedes S-Class idled quietly near the curb while snow drifted across its polished hood. The older man removed his leather gloves carefully. "Good morning," he said politely. "We are looking for Mrs. Vivian Sterling." The moment he said her full name, I felt the entire atmosphere shift behind me. Melissa inhaled sharply. Andrew stared at the man in confusion. And for the first time since arriving at my house, Vivian looked tired instead of guarded. "I told you not to follow me," she said quietly from the kitchen. The older man stepped inside respectfully, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Sterling, everyone has been searching for you for weeks." "Weeks?" I slowly turned toward Vivian, my mind racing. "Searching?" I repeated softly. The man nodded. "Your attorney has been extremely concerned." "Attorney? Not social worker. Not shelter coordinator. Attorney." Melissa's expression changed instantly. The suspicion disappeared from her face and was replaced by something far more calculating. "Wait," she said carefully, "Sterling? As in Sterling Development Group?" Vivian closed her eyes briefly as if exhausted by the question. Nobody in the Chicago suburbs would fail to recognize that name. Sterling Development owned luxury hotels, commercial towers, retirement communities, and half the new real estate developments across northern Illinois. Andrew looked stunned. "That is impossible," he whispered. But deep down, I think all of us already knew the truth before Vivian finally spoke again. I was married to Charles Sterling for 42 years, she said quietly, before my own family decided I had become inconvenient. Outside my house, more black vehicles slowly filled the snowy street while my neighbors watched through their windows in complete disbelief. For several seconds, nobody in my living room moved. Snow continued falling softly outside while the line of black vehicles stretched farther down the street, turning my quiet suburban neighborhood into something that looked more like the entrance to a political fundraiser than an ordinary winter morning. I could practically feel the curiosity radiating from behind every curtain on the block. Diane Cooper stood frozen near her mailbox, staring toward my house with her mouth slightly open. Melissa slowly sat down on the edge of the couch as though her knees had suddenly weakened. Sterling development? She repeated under her breath. As in the Sterling family? Vivian did not answer immediately. She simply looked tired now. Not frightened. Not ashamed. Just deeply exhausted. The older man standing near my front door lowered his voice respectfully. Mrs. Sterling, Mr. Calloway has been trying to reach you for days. Vivian gave a faint nod. I know. Everyone feared the worst after you disappeared from Lake Forest. Andrew looked completely lost. Lake Forest? He asked. Melissa turned toward him immediately. The Sterling estate is in Lake Forest, she whispered quickly. It is one of the wealthiest areas outside Chicago. Suddenly, every strange detail from the last 24 hours crashed together in my mind. The polished manners, the diamond ring, the luxury vehicles, the way Vivian spoke about money-destroying families like she had lived through it herself. I looked at her carefully. You were homeless? Vivian finally met my eyes. There was sadness there, but also honesty. For a little while, yes. But why? I asked softly. The older man near the door glanced uncertainly toward her as though debating whether he should leave the room. Vivian saved him the trouble. It is all right, Thomas, she said quietly. At this point there is no point hiding any of it. Thomas nodded respectfully and stepped farther back toward the hallway. Vivian folded her hands neatly in her lap before speaking again. After my husband died 2 years ago, my family changed very quickly. Charles handled most of the company affairs himself. Once he was gone, everyone suddenly became very interested in control. Melissa listened intensely now, her earlier disgust completely gone. Control of what? She asked carefully. Vivian looked toward her with a calm expression. Everything. The room stayed silent except for the soft ticking of my kitchen clock. Charles left behind a very large estate. Vivian continued. Properties, investments, trusts, foundations, more money than anyone could spend in 3 lifetimes. Andrew swallowed visibly. Even he seemed uncomfortable hearing numbers like that spoken aloud. Vivian's voice remained composed, but I noticed her fingers tightening slightly together. At first my children insisted they only wanted to help me manage things while I grieved. Lawyers started visiting constantly. Documents appeared every week. Meetings. Financial advisors. Accountants. She paused briefly. Then one day I realized nobody was asking what I wanted anymore. I felt something heavy settle in my chest because I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. Not the money part, but the invisible loneliness that comes when people slowly stop seeing you as a person and start treating you like an obstacle. Vivian looked toward the snowy street outside. Eventually, my grandson suggested it would be safer if I stopped driving. My daughter said I seemed forgetful. A doctor I barely knew recommended assisted living evaluations. Melissa shifted uncomfortably on the couch. That is awful, she murmured. Vivian gave a bitter little smile. It became worse after I refused to sign certain papers. What papers? Andrew asked quietly. Vivian looked directly at him now. Documents transferring control of several trusts before my death. The room fell silent again. Even Melissa looked disturbed now. They try to pressure you? I asked softly. Vivian nodded once. Families rarely become cruel all at once. It happens gradually. Small humiliations. Exclusion from conversations. Decisions made without you. One day you realize your own home no longer belongs to you emotionally. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I thought about the way Andrew and Melissa often talked around me instead of to me. The way they made comments about my age when discussing finances or repairs around the house. Small things, but painful ones. So you left? I asked. Vivian lowered her eyes. I needed to know whether anyone in this world still knew how to treat another human being with kindness when there was nothing to gain from it. Melissa suddenly straightened slightly. What do you mean by that? Vivian looked calmly toward her. I spent weeks moving through different towns without telling anyone who I was. Sometimes I stayed in shelters. Sometimes hotels under different names. Sometimes nowhere at all. I could barely believe what I was hearing. And nobody helped you? Vivian gave a faint, sad smile. Most people looked away. Then her eyes shifted toward me. Except Helen. The warmth in her voice caught me completely off guard. Outside, another black SUV pulled slowly onto the street, while neighbors openly gathered near their driveways pretending not to stare. But inside my house, something far more uncomfortable was happening. Melissa's entire attitude had changed. I could see it happening right in front of me. The judgment, the irritation, the disgust, all replaced now by forced politeness and careful curiosity. And for the first time since this strange situation began, I realized Vivian saw it too. The atmosphere inside my house shifted completely after that conversation. It was subtle at first, but impossible not to notice once it began. Melissa suddenly offered to make fresh coffee for everyone even though she had barely acknowledged Vivian the night before. Andrew started speaking. Softer, more carefully, as though he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. And outside, my neighborhood continued transforming into a spectacle. By noon, at least 7 luxury vehicles lined the street in front of my house, while neighbors found increasingly creative excuses to stand outside in the cold. Diane Cooper walked her little white dog past my driveway 3 separate times in less than an hour. At one point, I even caught her pretending to sprinkle salt near her mailbox while staring directly through my front windows. Vivian noticed it too. Curiosity spreads quickly in wealthy neighborhoods, she said calmly, while sitting beside my fireplace. People become uncomfortable when they realize they judged someone incorrectly. Melissa gave a nervous laugh from the kitchen. Well, nobody could have known who you were. Vivian slowly turned her eyes toward her. That is precisely the point. The room went quiet again. Melissa busied herself rearranging coffee mugs she had already organized twice. I could almost see the embarrassment settling deeper into her face each time she remembered how she had spoken to Vivian the night before. But Vivian never raised her voice. She never insulted anyone. Somehow that made the tension even worse. Around 1 o'clock, Thomas returned carrying several garment bags and a leather briefcase. Mrs. Sterling, he said respectfully, your attorney has arrived. A tall older man in an expensive navy coat stepped inside behind him. His silver hair was perfectly combed despite the snow outside. Vivian, he said gently, thank God you are safe. Vivian stood slowly from the armchair, and for the first time since I met her, emotion visibly cracked through her composure. Hello, Richard. The attorney approached carefully and took both her hands. Everyone has been terrified. Vivian smiled faintly. Not everyone. Something painful flickered briefly across Richard's face before he glanced toward the rest of us. I owe all of you my gratitude, he said politely. Melissa straightened immediately. Oh, it was no trouble at all, she replied far too quickly. I almost stared at her in disbelief. 24 hours earlier she had wanted Vivian thrown out of my house. Now she sounded like she was hosting a charity luncheon. Vivian noticed it too. I could tell by the almost invisible sadness in her eyes. Richard opened the leather briefcase and carefully removed several folders. There are urgent matters requiring your signature, he explained quietly. Board members have been panicking since your disappearance. Good, Vivian replied simply. Melissa blinked in surprise. You wanted them worried? Vivian looked toward the snowy window. Sometimes people reveal their true character when they believe power is suddenly available. Her words landed heavily in the room because everyone understood exactly what she meant. Andrew shifted awkwardly beside the couch. Mrs. Sterling, he said carefully, if you do not mind me asking, why did you leave without security or telling anyone? Vivian remained silent for several seconds. Then she looked directly at him. Because I needed to know whether kindness still existed when money was removed from the equation. Nobody answered. Richard quietly adjusted his glasses. Vivian spent several weeks traveling anonymously, he explained softly. Most people ignored her completely. Some treated her poorly. One man tried recording her outside a gas station for social media. Vivian gave a tired little smile. Apparently old women make entertaining content now. I felt my chest tighten hearing that. Richard continued speaking. A few people offered temporary help once they recognized her name. But your mother, he said while turning toward Andrew. was the only person who helped, expecting absolutely nothing in return. The room became painfully quiet after that. Melissa lowered her eyes toward the floor. Outside, another black SUV pulled up near the curb while neighbors openly gathered at the ends of their driveways pretending not to watch. Then Diane Cooper suddenly marched across my lawn carrying a pie dish she clearly grabbed as an excuse to approach the house. Before I could stop her, she rang the doorbell with exaggerated enthusiasm. Melissa muttered under her breath, "Oh my God." I opened the door cautiously. Diane stood there smiling far too brightly. "Helen," she said loudly enough for half the street to hear, "I just wanted to check whether your guest needed anything." Vivian appeared behind me before I could answer. Diane froze the moment she saw her standing there calmly beside the fireplace. "Mrs. Sterling," Diane whispered, her entire expression changing instantly. Vivian gave her a polite nod. "Good afternoon." Diane suddenly looked like someone realizing she had accidentally insulted royalty. "I had no idea," she stammered nervously. Vivian's smile remained perfectly calm. "No," she replied softly. "You only saw an old homeless woman." Diane's face turned bright red. And standing there in my own front doorway, watching wealthy suburban people scramble to rewrite their behavior overnight, I finally understood exactly what Vivian had been testing all along. By late afternoon, my house no longer felt like my house at all. Black SUVs lined both sides of the street, while men in tailored coats quietly moved in and out carrying folders, garment bags, and phones that never seemed to stop ringing. Neighbors walked past every 15 minutes pretending to shovel snow or check their mail while openly staring toward my windows. Maplewood Heights had never seen anything like this before. But the strangest part was not the luxury cars or the sudden attention. It was watching how quickly people changed once they learned Vivian Sterling was rich. Melissa transformed almost overnight. She offered Vivian tea in my best china cups. She complimented her coat after spending the previous evening calling her dangerous. At one point, I even overheard Melissa asking whether Vivian preferred organic groceries, because she would be happy to pick some up. The whole thing made my stomach turn. Vivian noticed everything, but she never reacted emotionally. She simply observed people the way someone studies weather patterns before a storm. Around 4 o'clock, Richard and Thomas left briefly for meetings downtown, leaving the house unusually quiet for the first time all day. Snow continued falling outside, while Vivian sat near the fireplace wrapped in one of my cream-colored blankets. She looked exhausted now that the constant interruptions had stopped. I carried 2 bowls of soup into the living room and handed one to her. "You should rest," I said gently. Vivian smiled faintly. I forgot what kindness without conditions feels like. That sentence stayed with me. I sat quietly across from her while the fireplace crackled softly between us. "Can I ask you something honestly?" I said after a moment. "Of course. Did you really plan all this?" Vivian tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" "Traveling anonymously. Testing people." She looked down at the soup bowl in her hands. "Not at first. At first I simply wanted to breathe somewhere nobody recognized me." Her voice grew quieter. "But after a while, I became curious." "Curious about what?" Vivian looked directly at me then. "About whether anyone still saw value in people once status disappeared." The honesty in her voice made my chest ache a little. "And what did you find?" I asked softly. A sad smile crossed her face. "Most people do not look at old women long enough to see anything at all." Before I could answer, the front door suddenly opened again. Andrew and Melissa stepped inside, carrying several shopping bags from an expensive department store downtown. Melissa smiled brightly the moment she saw Vivian. Too brightly. "We brought you some things," she said cheerfully. Vivian blinked in surprise as Melissa placed the bags carefully beside the couch. "You did not need to do that." "We wanted to," Melissa insisted quickly. "After everything you have been through." Andrew nodded beside her, though he looked far less comfortable. Melissa began pulling items from the bags one by one. Cashmere sweaters, leather gloves, designer scarves. Everything expensive. Everything carefully chosen to impress. "This color would look beautiful on you," Melissa said while holding up a cream-colored sweater. Vivian studied her quietly for several seconds before speaking. "Last night you wanted me removed from this house." The room froze instantly. Melissa's smile faltered. Andrew shifted awkwardly near the doorway. "I was worried about Helen," Melissa answered carefully. Vivian continued watching her calmly. "No," she replied softly. "You were." embarrassed by me. The silence afterward felt unbearable. Melissa's cheeks flushed deep red. I did not know who you were, she whispered. Vivian's expression never changed. Exactly. I looked down at my soup because suddenly I could not bear watching the discomfort on Melissa's face. Not because I felt sorry for her, but because Vivian was exposing something ugly all of us recognized. People did not suddenly become kinder after learning the truth. They simply adjusted their behavior toward money. Vivian finally set the untouched sweater aside. Do you know what surprised me most during these past weeks? She asked quietly. Nobody answered. It was not cruelty. Cruelty I expected. She glanced toward the snowy street outside. It was how quickly human beings calculate value the moment wealth enters a room. Andrew rubbed his forehead tiredly. Mrs. Sterling, Melissa did not mean any harm. Vivian looked toward him now. Your wife called me dangerous before speaking to me for more than 30 seconds. Andrew had no response to that. Melissa suddenly stood up from the couch, visibly emotional now. I said things I regret, she admitted quietly. But people make mistakes. Vivian studied her for a long moment before giving a small nod. Yes, she said softly. They do. Then she turned toward me instead. Helen, may I ask you something? Of course. Vivian's eyes softened for the first time all day. Why did you help me when everyone else walked away? The question caught me completely off guard. I looked down at my hands for a moment before answering honestly. Because you looked lonely. Vivian's eyes filled slightly with emotion at that answer. And standing there in my living room, surrounded by luxury shopping bags and people suddenly desperate to appear compassionate, I realized loneliness was the one thing money had never protected either of us from. The following morning, Maplewood Heights looked like it was hosting a celebrity event. By 8 o'clock, at least 20 people stood scattered across the sidewalks pretending to walk dogs or collect mail while staring openly toward my house. News traveled fast in wealthy suburbs, but gossip about hidden billionaires traveled even faster. I stood at the kitchen window holding my coffee while watching Diane Cooper whisper dramatically to another neighbor near the corner mailbox cluster. Vivian sat quietly at the dining table reviewing documents with Richard while sunlight reflected softly against the snow outside. Somehow she looked both powerful and heartbreakingly lonely at the same time. You should not have to deal with all this attention, I said quietly. Vivian gave a faint smile without looking up from the paperwork. Attention is temporary. Human nature is permanent. Around noon, another black sedan arrived, but this time the people stepping out were not lawyers or assistants. They were younger, expensively dressed, perfectly polished. A blonde woman wearing oversized sunglasses and a cream-colored designer coat walked quickly toward my front door, followed by a man in his 40s carrying frustration across his face like a storm cloud. The moment Vivian saw them through the window, all warmth disappeared from her expression. My daughter Caroline, she said softly, and my son Daniel. Richard sighed quietly under his breath. I tried delaying them. Vivian folded her hands calmly together. It was inevitable. The front door opened before I could even reach it. Caroline stepped inside first, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Mother, she said immediately. Not Mom. Not are you all right? Just Mother. Daniel followed behind her looking tense and exhausted. Do you realize what you have done to this family? He demanded. The room instantly became cold. Vivian remained seated. Good afternoon to you as well. Caroline removed her sunglasses impatiently. Do you understand the media chaos this has caused? Reporters are already contacting board members. Vivian looked at her calmly. Interesting. I disappeared for nearly 3 weeks, and your primary concern is public relations. Daniel rubbed his forehead angrily. You vanished without security, without informing anyone. Do you know how irresponsible that was? I watched Vivian carefully, then because something shifted in her eyes. Not fear, not guilt, disappointment, deep disappointment. I wanted to know whether anyone would search for me out of love instead of financial panic, she said softly. Neither Caroline nor Daniel answered immediately. That silence said everything. Melissa suddenly stepped forward awkwardly as though trying to smooth the situation over. Mrs. Sterling has been safe here, she said quickly. Caroline barely glanced at her. And you are? Melissa looked momentarily embarrassed. I am Helen's daughter-in-law. Caroline nodded distractedly before turning back toward Vivian. Mother, you need to come home now. Vivian's expression remained perfectly composed. No, The single word stunned everyone in the room. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. What do you mean, no? I mean, Vivian replied calmly, I am tired of returning to places where I am treated like an inconvenience attached to a bank account. Caroline crossed her arms tightly. That is not fair. Vivian slowly stood from the dining table. Even at 79 years old, she carried herself with remarkable dignity. Fair, she repeated quietly. Your father had not even been buried for 6 months before lawyers began appearing in my dining room. Nobody spoke. Vivian continued. You question my memory, my judgment, my independence. Every conversation became about signatures and control. Daniel looked frustrated now. We were trying to protect you. Vivian's eyes sharpened slightly. No, you were trying to protect access. The room fell completely silent after that. Even Richard lowered his eyes. Outside, neighbors gathered farther down the sidewalks, pretending not to stare toward the windows. Caroline's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. You are humiliating this family, she whispered. Vivian gave a sad little smile. No, Caroline. Your behavior accomplished that long before I arrived here. I felt chills hearing her say it so calmly. No screaming. No cruelty. Just truth spoken quietly enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then something happened I never expected. Vivian walked slowly toward me and placed one hand gently over mine. Helen treated me with more kindness in one night than my own family has shown me in 2 years, she said softly. The words landed heavily in the room. Caroline looked stunned. Daniel stared toward the floor. Melissa shifted uncomfortably near the fireplace. Vivian's voice trembled slightly now, though she kept her composure. Do you know what your mother asked me the first night I arrived here? Caroline remained silent. She asked whether I was cold. Vivian smiled sadly. Not whether I was valuable. Not whether I was important. Not whether I owned anything. Her eyes filled slightly with emotion. Just whether I was cold. Nobody in the room could answer after that. And standing there inside my small suburban house, while wealthy people in designer coats struggled to defend themselves, I realized Vivian Sterling had not disappeared to escape danger. She disappeared because she wanted to know whether genuine human kindness still existed anywhere at all. 3 months later, winter had finally started fading from Maplewood Heights. Snow piles disappeared from the curbs, flower beds slowly returned to life, and the neighborhood gossip eventually found newer targets. But some things never returned to the way they were before Vivian Sterling walked into my life, carrying that worn leather suitcase. I still woke up early every morning, still drank coffee beside the kitchen window, still watched the quiet suburban street come alive as people rushed toward work and school. The difference was that I no longer felt invisible while doing it. Vivian had changed that somehow. After everything that happened, she refused to return permanently to the enormous Sterling estate in Lake Forest. Instead, she divided her time between several properties while restructuring nearly every major part of her late husband's foundation. The newspapers called it a dramatic philanthropic shift. Wealth magazines speculated endlessly about family tensions inside the Sterling empire. But none of them understood the real reason behind her decisions. Vivian had spent decades surrounded by luxury only to discover kindness mattered more than status in the end. And somehow, in the middle of all that chaos, she kept coming back to my little house in Maplewood Heights. Sometimes she arrived with drivers and assistants, sometimes quietly by herself in a simple sedan. But every visit felt less like hosting a billionaire and more like seeing an old friend who finally found somewhere peaceful enough to breathe. One afternoon in early March, Vivian invited me to lunch downtown at a private restaurant overlooking the Chicago River. I nearly laughed when I saw the valet attendants panic slightly the moment her car arrived. I still do not understand why you insist on treating me like this, I told her while we sat near the window overlooking the water. Vivian smiled over the rim of her teacup. Because you treated me with dignity when you believed I had nothing. Her voice softened slightly. Very few people passed that test. After lunch, she handed me a cream-colored envelope embossed with the Sterling Foundation seal. What is this? I asked cautiously. An opportunity, Vivian replied. Inside was a formal letter appointing me to the board of a new charitable initiative focused on housing and support for abandoned senior women across Illinois. I stared at the page in disbelief. Vivian, I am not qualified for this. She gave me a look I had come to recognize very well. Calm. Certain. Helen, You are more qualified than most executives I have met. I do not know anything about running foundations. Vivian reached across the table and gently placed her hand over mine. You know how to see people. That matters far more. I felt tears sting my eyes unexpectedly. At 67 years old, I had spent years believing the meaningful parts of my life were already behind me. Widowhood had quietly shrunk my world. My son became distant. Holidays became smaller. Even inside my own family, I often felt like a polite obligation instead of someone truly important. But Vivian somehow saw value in me when I had forgotten how to see it myself. Andrew changed after everything that happened too. Not overnight. Real change never happens that way. But little by little, I noticed him listening more carefully when I spoke, visiting more often, calling without needing something first. As for Melissa, embarrassment humbled her in ways wealth never could. She became quieter around me after that winter, less performative, less dismissive. Sometimes I think watching Vivian expose how quickly people change around money forced all of us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. Even Diane Cooper transformed in her own strange suburban way. She now waved enthusiastically every morning and once brought over lemon bars while pretending the entire situation had simply been a misunderstanding. Vivian found that particularly amusing. Human beings rewrite history very quickly when shame enters the room. She whispered to me afterward with a smile. But the moment I remember most happened one quiet evening in April. Vivian and I sat on my back porch watching the sunset spill soft orange light across the neighborhood rooftops while birds drifted through the cool evening air. No bodyguards nearby, no lawyers, no luxury cars. Just two older women sitting quietly together after surviving loneliness in different forms. Do you regret leaving? I asked her softly. Vivian thought for a long moment before answering. No, she said finally. For the first time in years, someone looked at me and saw a human being before seeing my last name. I looked out toward the fading sunlight, while emotion tightened quietly in my chest. Because the truth was, Vivian had done the same thing for me. And sometimes I still think about that freezing night outside the grocery store when everyone else walked past an old homeless woman sitting alone in the cold. They saw inconvenience. They saw embarrassment. They saw someone worthless. But all I saw was another lonely woman who needed warmth. And in the end, that simple act of kindness changed both our lives forever.